It's often said that in the ancient world there were many myths about dying and rising gods. People sometimes claim that Christianity borrowed the story of Jesus rising from the dead from these pagan myths. So is that what happened?
When you look around the ancient Near East, there are various mystery cults. Mithraism was a popular religion which was just coming in at the time of Jesus. There are various religions in Egypt which go way back beyond that, and other parts of the ancient Near East which often did speak about dying and rising gods, on the analogy that when you put a seed into the ground, you sow it in the autumn and the winter happens and it all appears sad and dark, and then in the spring the new green shoots come up. And so basically this is the old fertility myth which goes way back, that somehow the gods are involved with the life of the world and with sex and marriage and with seed time and harvest and all of that. So gods are, as it were, created out of this.
The claim by scholars who tried to interpret Jesus as just a myth was that in pagan religions you had parallel myths of dying and rising deities, and the disciples, somehow aware of these myths, came to apply them to Jesus and believed that Jesus was similarly risen. This movement has utterly collapsed today in scholarship. It only persists in popular sensationalistic literature on the internet. It is not a view held by scholars.
Well, we're all familiar with a boat about 100 years ago that was sailing across the Atlantic. It was regarded as unsinkable, a passenger liner a little over 800 feet long. And on one cold April evening, about 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, it hits an iceberg and it sinks, and more than half of its passengers die as a result of a lack of lifeboats. The name of that boat, it was the the Titan, the wreck of the Titan, because you see there was this novel named Futility, the Wreck of the Titan, that was written in 1898, 14 years prior to the sinking of the Titanic. Now many people would look at that and nobody would say that the Titanic was a fictitious story, a legend that was made up, a myth, and that's based, we know that because of the Wreck of the Titan. No, some things just have some very striking similarities. You have to show the causal connection, and it's the same thing with the resurrection of Jesus. Another thing I would point out is that you've got to show more than that there's just similar reports. For example, we're all aware of a plane that took off from Massachusetts early one morning and just after 9 o'clock flew into one of the largest skyscrapers in the world in New York City between the 79th and 80th floor, killing everybody on board and many people working in the building at that time. Well, we know what I'm talking about. It's when the B-25 flew into the Empire State Building in July in 1945. Yep, that actually happened, and it's the same exact floors as the 767 that flew into the South Tower on 9/11. But no one's going to suggest that because all of these striking similarities exist, that 9/11 was a myth that occurred over time. You can have similarities, but you have to show a causal connection between them. And in the case of Jesus' resurrection, we have extraordinary historical evidence to show that it occurred. We don't have that in the case of any other of these events of dying and rising figures in antiquity.
When you look at these myths closely, what you discover is that most of them are just mythical symbols of the crop cycle as the vegetation dies in the dry season and then comes back to life in the rainy season. They have nothing to do with people literally dying and rising from the dead. And so the parallels turned out to be quite spurious, in fact, when you look at them closely.
Well, this idea that there are these rising and dying gods is very different from the central claim of the Christian faith, because the pagan myths or the Roman myths are not claiming to be historical. There isn't an attachment to a historical figure. That's the first difference.
The thing is then that there is no evidence that the early Christians borrowed any of this stuff from those ancient mythological religions. On the contrary, in the Jewish world, they believed in resurrection, or the Pharisees who were in the ascendancy at the time of Jesus believed that all people would be raised from the dead at the end. Nobody had imagined for a moment that it would happen to one person in the middle of history. That is, one of several radical innovations, not within the ancient pagan worldview, but within the ancient Jewish worldview. And that's the point where we say something new has happened here. How, as historians, can we explain it?
What scholars have found is that pagan mythology, Greco-Roman mythology, is not the right interpretive context for understanding Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth was a first-century Palestinian Jew, and his disciples were similarly first-century Palestinian Jews. And it is against the background of a Jewish milieu that Jesus of Nazareth is to be properly understood and interpreted, not against the background of pagan mythology. So those who say this is just a myth are simply dealing in the wrong interpretive categories.
This occurs, this resurrection claim occurs within a Jewish context. Jesus himself was a Jew, the first Christians were Jewish, and the Jews had an idea of resurrection, but they didn't have the idea of an individual person rising from the dead. They had the idea of a corporate resurrection from the dead. So the well-known scholar N.T. Wright takes this as a crucial piece of evidence that the resurrection of Jesus must have happened, because this idea of a Jewish individual Messiah rising from the dead couldn't have been inferred from anything else. It is unique, it is staggering. And those who made the claim at the time understood that. They knew that they were making an extraordinary claim, which is why they based their claim on evidence and attempted to convince people and persuade them that this had happened.
If you have the early Christians who are debating over whether Gentile males need to be circumcised, whether they can eat meat sacrificed to idols, whether Jews can even eat with Gentiles, do you really think the early Christians are going to borrow wholesale from pagan religions for their most important doctrine for the foundation of their faith? Very unlikely.
The idea that Christianity borrowed the story of Jesus rising from the dead from pagan myths doesn't stand up. We have to look for a different explanation of the evidence. Next time we'll look at the possibility that Jesus never really died on the cross, that he somehow survived being crucified.